to first acknowledge the importance of Jesse Leamish, Staunton Lynn's, and Howard Zinn for the work that I'm able to do. And not just a simple political acknowledgement, but an acknowledgement that they paved the way and paid a price for paving the way. Howard Zinn, as many of you know, never was appointed to a history department. He was in the political science department, and he, I think, was never given a raise after about 20 years, courtesy of John Silver at Boston University. Because Howard, like Jesse and Staunton, they didn't just practice a history of the bottom up, but they threw themselves in the movements of the people of the day that resembled the historical actors of the past. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Jesse Leamish paid a price by being fired from the University of Chicago because his politics interfered with his scholarship, as he was told by the administrators there. And Staunton maybe paid the biggest academic price of all, not simply for being a historian from the bottom up, but for practicing an activist life of identifying with the struggles in his day, traveling to Illinois, so on and so forth. And to give a good example, when Staunton says history from the bottom up is an orientation, it's an attitude, it's not a set of conclusions, I like to show a photograph with two quotations to help symbolize that attitude, keeping in mind that Staunton was fired really effectively by one of the people who say these quotations. I used to say the great John Morton Blum, the Yale historian, but I had sent my paper to Al Young, phrasing it that way, and he wrote back, "Believes." Maybe an extra E in there. So John Morton Blum was Staunton's chair at Yale. Yale University had told Staunton that he would not be granted tenure in 1968, effectively firing him, and he was subsequently blacklisted. Literally blacklisted. I won't go into all those details from academia. And the reason they told him was because the book that I'll mention later, The Intellectual Origins of American Radicalism, one book considerably weakened his scholarly record. Imagine scholars out there being told that today, how we might react to that. So here's the photograph, and I'll walk through so folks can see. It comes from an August, it's going to be hard to see, it comes from an August 1965 march where Staunton is approaching the Capitol with Dave Dellinger and Bob Moses. Life magazine, for whatever reason, does not include Bob Moses, but includes Staunton and Dave Dellinger. Staunton is on the left hand, my left hand side. Dave Dellinger is the one with red paint on his face.
I have the tie.
My name is Carl Mirra. Folks can't see that, but here's the first quotation from John Morton Blum, the Yale history chair and professor. That activists of the 1960s reached a point where they were mad, not in a clinical sense, but in an emotional sense. Excessively emotional, not subject to rational discourse about either urban racial issues and or the war in Vietnam. That photo of Lynn with the blood across him and his arm raised really represents the mood he had cultivated in himself. The mood he had cultivated in himself. Of course, his arm isn't raised and his shirt isn't torn, but you don't need historical details as historians. Jack Walsh, who was a worker in 1977 at the Schwebel Baking Company, led a wildcat strike, led an unauthorized strike, and he was sitting in a bar, and he needed a lawyer. Staunton was now a lawyer in Youngstown, and sure enough, the Youngstown Vindicator, a local paper, got news Staunton had moved into town, and they posted a picture, this picture, of him in the newspaper. Jack Walsh, an ordinary worker, saw that picture and said, "Now there's a lawyer that I can trust." I think that symbolizes the attitude of a history from the bottom up. But it's an attitude that carries consequences as well. I don't know how many folks are familiar with Richard Moser's work called The New Winter Soldiers, but Richard Moser did extensive interviews with combat veterans of the Vietnam War and why they became resistors, and here's what he concluded. It's not an exact quote, but most of the words here are a quote. Needed to do its overflow. Moser concludes that the primary historical reference point for these veterans was the American Revolution. Their alternative patriotism recovered an American tradition represented by the Revolutionary Minutemen, rebellious seamen, winter soldier, and the white and black abolitionist soldier and armed fugitive slave of the Civil War. Social activism was the highest form of patriotism for these veterans, an engagement animated by the sense that the values of the American Revolution were yet to be achieved.